the AFROMEDI initiative is really about bringing together journalists from across the continent to understand and engage on issues of development finance, more broadly speaking, but more specifically focusing on issues of debt and development. The intersection between debt and issues of taxation and domestic resource mobilization are things that we can't run away from, in the sense that they all intersect in a way that affects citizens. And journalists and the media fraternity as a whole play a very important role in two main ways. The first is connecting the general public with understanding what is happening on public finance, and especially now during a period of multiple crises that are affecting not only the globe but the continent in terms of debt, COVID-19, climate, and now more recently with the Ukraine-Russia. It's important for the public on the continent to understand how this manifests itself with regard to public finance issues. When governments are finding it very challenging to raise money within their economies, and because of their economic structure, they're being forced to borrow, and borrow from different places, different sources, with varying degrees of terms and conditions. Some are less concessional than others. Others, are coming primarily from private and commercial loans. And the role of the media in that sense, and what AFROMEDI is trying to do, is break that down into accessible bits of information so that the public can engage with these issues, because it affects them directly and indirectly. The second aspect of why we thought last year, when we launched the AFROMEDI initiative, it was important to have journalists and the media fraternity engaging on issues of public finance, is that they act also as an accountability mechanism. They have access to power, they have access to government, they have access to politicians who are in the know of how the machinery of state finance is working, right? And so having that conversation and engaging with decision makers, with politicians and with government on how they make decisions is also a way of trying to increase the accountability of the state in how it runs the public affairs. So that's really what the AFROMEDI is about, and why we feel it's important as a group of interested individuals and stakeholders and partners in this idea of pushing for economic, social and political justice on the continent. There's some interesting statistics out there with regard to journalists and the media fraternity on the continent in how they engage. I was reading a report by Reporters Without Borders, that seems to suggest a majority of what is being reported on the continent is actually being done by foreign journalists, right, and foreign media houses. And so for AFRODAD, we take that quite personally, because one of our calling cards or clarion calls as an organization is Africa the rule maker, not the rule taker. And if the idea is for us to tell our story as a continent, and if the idea is about us increasing and strengthening the agency of our continent as citizens, then it should be us who are responsible for defining the framework of what story is being told out there. A very good example is if you look at how COVID-19 was covered, and I mentioned this last year when we launched AFROMEDI, many people thought the continent was going to collapse. Some very influential people went as far as saying there would be bodies scattered on the streets of many African countries. But instead, the opposite happened. Many African governments rallied together. They coordinated how they responded to the pandemic. We had learned the lessons from dealing with big, major outbreaks of illnesses like Ebola, of how to do sectioning off of countries, how to do quarantining, how to do isolation, how to restrict movement to avoid the contagion from spreading, because we do not have the luxury of the social protection systems that countries in the global north have. So we had learnt from that, and it is important as journalists and as the media fraternity that we tell that story, so that it's not a story of just misery, death, destruction that is being reported out there, because otherwise that's the only impression the rest of the world has of the continent and of us as citizens, as a hopeless continent, which is very wrong. And that's the idea around the AFROMEDI, and why we felt it was important this year in the second edition of AFROMEDI to actually have a physical meeting is because we wanted to defy, the issues around restricted movement. I'm sure you as journalists, we as civil society have really struggled to access power, to access processes that are instrumental in making decisions. And this gathering here over the last 2.5 days is a show of defiance to say that we can actually meet and talk and keep that fire burning about what the issues are that the public need to be aware of and to engage. So that is what AFROMEDI is about. That's what AFROMEDI 2 really this year was trying to do, was to defy that idea that we can't access each other and we can't exchange ideas from different parts of the continent.
You and I are the people who hold our governments to